Bonjour and welcome back to the World History course. I am your professor, Philippe Girard. If you're wondering why your professor has a beard all of a sudden, it's because I'm taping this in September 2020 and my hometown was just ravaged by Hurricane Laura. I haven't had electricity in 2 weeks and water for part of that time either, so instead of shaving, I've done other activities like fixing my roof or cutting oak trees or replacing windows or just generally trying to survive. 2 weeks ago in that room, 2 windows were broken here and 130 miles per hour winds were blowing through the place. The whole house was shaking and trees were falling right and left. But things are quieting down right now. I got a generator going for electricity, so I figured I would tape a few videos for the World History course to take my mind away from all the calamities around me and keep my sanity. So here goes. In the first section of the course, we had covered the great civilization of antiquity, ending with Rome during the Pax Romana. Then in the second section, we explored the roots of the great religions of the world, including Christianity, which again brought us back to Rome in the first centuries AD. Today we'll begin the third section of the course, and it begins right where we left off at the end of the Roman Empire, and I will take us through the Middle Ages. Before we dive into our topic, let's pause for a second and ask yourself what image comes to your mind when you think of the term Middle Ages. Go ahead, pause for a second. My guess is that either you thought of peasants living in squalor, mud, torture, the plague, endless warfare, something akin to Game of Thrones, or you thought of chivalrous knights in shining armor and beautiful princesses, something closer to the movie A Knight's Tale. Either way, you'd be right. The Middle Ages saw all of this and many more things over its very long history. For the purpose of this course, we'll focus on just a few civilizations, such as the Franks, the Normans, the Byzantines, and the Arabs. And then to tie all of them together, we'll end with the First Crusade, where representatives of all these groups bumped into one another as they fought for Jerusalem. Well, history has a tendency to be all over the place, so using the Crusades as an endpoint was my way of tying the section together. Another question for you. Why do we call this period the Middle Ages? Middle Ages, that's a strange term. It's not defined by its own essence, but by the fact that it stands in the middle of 2 other, presumably more important periods. So that begs another question. When do the Middle Ages begin and when do they end? Well, so far as what came before, it's antiquity. All these ancient civilizations we studied in section 1 for Western Europe, that would be in the Roman Empire. And what came after? Well, the Renaissance, which was an attempt to revive the art and culture of ancient Rome and Greece, which had kind of slipped away during the Middle Ages. In fact, the term Renaissance, that means rebirth in French. So as a result, what comes after antiquity and before the Renaissance, that would be the Middle Ages in the middle. And that term doesn't sound flattering, and it's on purpose. The people who coined the term saw that era, the 1,000-year-long slump between the glory of ancient Rome and then later on the revival of the Renaissance. The term Gothic, as in Gothic art, was also meant as an insult initially. Also, I've seen students spell the adjective medieval as if it were evil, E-V-I-L. So no, it's medieval, ending with E-V-A-L. There's nothing evil about it. Anyway, I try to present history impartially, so I avoid treating the whole period as an afterthought, as a bad period. And in fact, there were a lot of notable achievements during that era. It's worth studying. So another question for you, which time frame are we talking about? So the start will be the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, which is 476 AD. And the end point would be the onset of the Renaissance, which would be the 13th or 14th century in Italy, although some historians also use the first voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492 as the official end to the Middle Ages. So roughly 1,000 years from the 400s to the 1400s. A lot happened in that incredibly long period, so historians further divide this era into 2 halves, the Low Middle Ages, which would be the period of turmoil until roughly the year 1000, and then the High Middle Ages, and the period of revival after that. And today we'll focus on the first period, the Low Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages. Dark Ages as in bad, barbaric. As I mentioned earlier, the official start date of the Middle Ages in Western Europe is the fall of the Roman Empire, which historians date very precisely to 476 AD. Rome dated all the way back to 753 BC, so its disappearance was a big deal. Why the Roman Empire fell is a favorite topic among armchair historians, and I don't have an armchair here. But everybody seems to have an opinion on the matter. According to some people, the Roman elite became pampered, indulgent, because of all the slaves that they had around them. That would be called the decadence of the Roman character. Others think that the empire fell because the citizens of Rome no longer wished to serve in the army, and they relied on barbarian mercenaries instead. Other historians blame the political ambitions of the would-be emperors who fought one civil war after another in the 200s and 300s. Others note that the Roman business model did not work anymore in the Pax Romana. There were no more lands to conquer and plunder by this time, whereas the cost of defending the empire, that kept going up. Or maybe the empire was weakened by disease, plagues, because there were a number of them in the latter part of the Roman Empire. Or maybe the climate got colder, or maybe it was bad plumbing. Romans used lead for their piping, so lead poisoning has been cited as one cause of the empire's decline. I tend to be more blasé about it. All the empires that I studied in history fall one day or another, so at some point Rome had to end too. And one day will be the turn for the end of the American Empire too. At any rate, history is not like biology, where you grow various microorganisms in isolated petri dishes to prove with 100% certainty that this type of antibiotic kills this type of microbe. In history, all the causal factors are kind of mixed up together, there is no control group, and we can't repeat the experiment either. So history can be 100% science, and we never know for sure what specific factor led to the fall of Rome. What we do know is the proximate cause, the cause for the immediate downfall of the empire, and that would be the barbarian invasions. The term barbarian is one I've used a lot, and it's a tad vague. The Romans used it to describe every person north of the Rhine and the Danube River. So that would include some Celtic people like the Gauls, but also Germanic tribes and even Slavs. And even some faraway groups like the Huns, Attila the Hun, who came all the way from the steppes of Central Asia. But anyway, by the 4th and 5th century AD, a number of these Asian nomads migrated from Eastern Europe into what is today Germany, and that forced the Germanic tribes that were in Germany to enter the Roman Empire to seek protection there. The Roman Empire by that time was too weak to deny them entry, and so the Germanic tribes entered the empire at will, and they simply settled wherever they wished. And so the Angles and the Saxons, they moved into what is today England. Then you have another Germanic group, the Franks, who moved into the province of Gaul, which was renamed after them, and that's what we call France today, the land of the Franks. And to this day, a number of French people have last names of Germanic origin because of the Frankish invasion. It's usually some kick-ass name of a 5th century Frankish warrior who was called the Killer or the Hammer in Old German, such as Gerhard, which means courageous spear, aka Gerard, yours truly. Apparently one of my ancestors was a Frankish warrior who brought down Rome. Good for him. Another barbarian tribe, that would be the Visigoths, and they took over the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Then another one, the Vandals, they occupied the lands in North Africa that had once been part of the Carthaginian Empire. And I'd like to note in passing that the term vandalizing today means the wanton destruction of public property. And we get that term from barbarian groups like the Vandals, who are obviously pretty good at destroying stuff, like sacking Rome. And one final group, the Ostrogoths, moved into what is today Italy to set up a kingdom of their own. So if you look at the map of the Western Roman Empire and you deduct England, France, Spain, Tunisia, Italy, what remains? Nothing. And this is what we mean by the fall of the Roman Empire. It was divided piecemeal between a series of successor states led by Germanic tribes. The official date for the fall of the Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the last emperor of Rome resigned, but you always have to be wary of sharp dividing lines in history. Obviously, the Roman Empire did not fall in one day or even 1 year. It was a gradual decline over centuries. And the empire did not completely disappear either. Roman law, Latin, Christianity, all these endured long after the fall of Rome. In fact, the eastern part of the empire survived for another 1,000 years under the name Byzantine Empire. So roughly 476 AD then, and only for Western Europe. The Romans had been far from gentle. We saw in previous lectures how they treated the Carthaginians, or Spartacus, or the Jewish rebels. But they had brought law and order to Europe for centuries, and the disappearance of that empire led to immense misery in the short term. That's what we call the Dark Ages. Wars became constant, life expectancy went down, the population contracted, long-distance commerce collapsed, public buildings fell into disarray, as did roads. Not that you'd want to travel anyway, because banditry flourished. Architecture tells the tale. Instead of the wide open Roman cities which had baths and aqueducts and theaters, but no walls, because who needs walls when there is peace? Medieval cities shrank. People either died or they moved to the countryside for sustenance, and the survivors huddled behind fortifications. Walls are not only a sign of a healthy society. Think of the Berlin Wall in Cold War Germany, or the wall between Israel and the occupied territories. Medieval Europe was a society of walls because everyone lived in fear. In this context, culture and literacy also took a step back. The few people who were still literate, usually the monks, they spent their time annotating and copying existing works of literature, preserving some of them, but adding little that was new. Even the Christian religion provided no unity in those dark times. Most Christians in Rome followed the doctrine of the Holy Trinity set up by the Council of Nicaea, whereas the German invaders, they generally embraced the Arian heresy and they refused to see Jesus as a god. Assuming that those invaders converted at all, there were still quite a few people worshipping the old gods, especially in the countryside, which, by the way, is why we speak of pagans. In Latin, the term pagan referred to people who lived outside of cities. Country people also happened to reject Christianity, so pagan came to mean non-Christian. Ultimately, all these problems, whether it's a changing architecture, or lower life expectancy, or economic contraction, or religious disputes, they all boil down to war. The various successor states of Rome fought each other constantly. Some of it had to do with the rules of succession, what happens when a king dies. The Franks in France, they were ruled by a dynasty of kings called the Merovingians, and according to their system, all the sons deserved a share of their dad's kingdom. Daughters did not inherit of the share of the kingdom, which is unfair, but the monarchy itself is unfair by definition. Anyway, all the sons got a share, and so there was no primogeniture, which is the alternate system where the firstborn son would get everything. This seemingly egalitarian clause created countless problems because these Merovingian kings had a lot of sons. They had converted to Christianity, so they were technically limited to just one wife, but in practice they were serial monogamous. They had one wife, and then another, and then another. This meant that when they died, there might be 6 sons vying for the throne, each of them backed by a different mother-in-law, and things quickly got nasty. We're talking endless palace intrigues, murder, civil wars, until finally only one son remained standing after decades of turmoil and killing all his brothers, at which point that king died of old age and the process began anew with the next generation of sons. In this context, kings were generally weak and ineffective. They only controlled what territory they could conquer on their own and only as long as they lived. As for the services that we generally expect from a government nowadays, like education, roads, or just basic personal safety, the kings provided none of those. To quote Ronald Reagan, government was not the solution to the problem back then, it was the problem. Kings were the people who started endless wars, and that's it. I said earlier that you can read the politics of the early Middle Ages in Europe, architecture and the landscape, the small walled cities, surrounded by growing forests. These were a sign of a falling population and endemic warfare. But the law is also a good way to study this changing society. The Roman Empire had a code of laws, Roman law, which survived among some of the inhabitants of Europe. But the Germanic tribes brought their own law, which was also enforced. Basically, which law applied to you depending on whether you were one of the earlier inhabitants under Roman law or one of the new conquerors under Germanic law, and that led to much confusion. Traditionally, among nomadic Germanic tribes, there was no centralized system of law and order, such as the police you could call in case of trouble, or a local judge who would settle disputes. Instead, your extended family, your clan, would have your back. If a member of a rival family killed one of your own, your best option was to call upon your kin to kill one of their own and avenge the death. And then the rival family would do the same back to your family, and you would have a blood feud that would last for generations, causing many deaths on top of the original one. I mentioned a similar system in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, when Arabia was also a wild and lawless place. One way to end a blood feud was to buy off your adversary, to pay gold, or Wehrgeld in Old German, in other words, blood money. There was an agreed upon sum for how much each life was worth. So if a rival clan killed your sister, you could avenge her death. Or simply look up the standard price for a sister, and then you would ask for a lump sum. What's great for historians is that we can know the social pecking order of the time based on how much Wehrgeld each person was worth. So obviously a noble was worth more than a commoner or a slave, but surprisingly in this patriarchal society governed by men, young women, they were considered extremely valuable, more so than young men of equivalent rank. Ask yourself, why the discrepancy? Why are women worth more than men? Well, it's because those women were in their childbearing years, which is another hint that the population of Europe had collapsed so much that there was a major premium on reproduction. We'll see that when we study medieval Africa as well. Another difficulty for medieval legal experts was how to tell the truth. What would you do if two people of equal rank each claimed that the other was lying? No lie detector back then, no DNA, no security camera, no CSI Merovingian. We studied a similar issue when studying the code of laws of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon. And the answer was the ordeal. Nowadays, when we use that term, we mean something mildly annoying. I went to the mall the weekend before Christmas, parking was a nightmare, and I had to wait in line for an hour at the register at the Gap. God, what an ordeal. But the medieval ordeal, from which we get the word, was much more precise and a tad more painful. An ordeal in medieval law that involved asking a person who was suspected of lying to subject themselves to some agonizing and possibly deadly procedure. An ordeal by fire might involve walking through a giant pyre or holding a piece of red-hot metal. An ordeal by hot water might involve fetching a stone at the bottom of a kettle filled with boiling water. And then, after the suspect endured this harrowing experience, legal scholars would examine their wounds. If it was a horrible, festering burn that got infected, it meant that the person had been lying. If the suspect overcame the challenge somewhat unscathed, that meant that they were innocent. Sorry, old chap, for putting your hand in a kettle or boiling water. We just had to check. The wager by battle was an alternate method, especially among higher-born warriors. When two combatants accused the other of being a liar, they would just fight it out, and the one who won, obviously, was the one telling the truth. That may seem silly, but there was more to this system than just might makes right. There was a method to the madness. People would invoke God and ask him to oversee the proceedings, so that the person who survived the ordeal or won the wager by battle was not just stronger than the other, that person was protected by God because that person was being truthful. That was a divine lie detector test. As you may have noticed already, I tend to be skeptical with all things religious, so I have my doubts about the technique. And people in the Middle Ages did too. The practice eventually died out in 1215 when the Pope barred priests from taking part in ordeals. And after that, without a priest, there was no guarantee that God was present and the ordeal was no longer valid. So the ordeals came to an end. The torture itself, that remained a valid legal recourse in France, at least until the French Revolution. Because the Middle Ages were so long, not every period was gloom and doom. Around the year 800, there was a brief period of stability known as the Carolingian Renaissance. That era is named after Charlemagne, aka Charles the Great, or Carolus Magnus in Latin. Carolus leads to Carolingian. Charlemagne was a Frankish king, but from a different family. That's why we speak of the Carolingian dynasty instead of the earlier Merovingian dynasty. He's officially Saint Charlemagne in the Catholic Church today, but I find it a bit hard to justify. The reason why he was able to gather such a large empire is that he was more efficient than others at killing his enemies, which doesn't sound too saintly to me. His treatment of the Saxons of East Germany was particularly brutal, for example. But that's history for you. The people we remember are often the bloodthirsty conquerors. On the positive side, after defeating his enemies, Charlemagne managed to create an empire almost as vast as the old Western Roman Empire. That empire of Charlemagne included Germany, the Low Countries, France, Switzerland, plus bits of Spain and Italy. So in the year 800, he traveled to Rome to be crowned, not just as king, but as Emperor Charlemagne. Notice how centuries after the official end of Rome, the dreams of a united Europe ruled by one single man that was still there. The Roman Empire had died, but the idea of Rome, that still remained. With Europe united for now, commerce rebounded somewhat, as did culture. Charlemagne set up his capital at Aix-la-Chapelle, or Aachen, which is in Germany today, and that became famous as a center for religion and the arts. He promoted education in particular, so he personally never managed to write properly because he learned to write too late and he liked the fine motor skills. Sometimes a pen is mightier to wield than a sword. And then, of course, one day Charlemagne died. He only had one surviving son, so his empire survived for another generation intact. But then that son had 3 sons, and without rules of primogeniture, all 3 grandsons claimed their share, and the empire was divided at the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. One grandson got roughly the Germany of today, another one got France, and the third got some unwieldy monstrosity, Lotharingia, which stretched through the Netherlands, Alsace, Switzerland, and northern Italy like some long buffer zone between Germany and France. And you guessed it, the 3 sons immediately went to war. The Middle Kingdom, Lotharingia, that was indefensible and it didn't last long. So France and Germany spent the next 1,000 years fighting over bits in the middle, like Alsace and Lorraine. So in a way, there's a direct line from the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the Empire of Charlemagne, all the way to the Battle of Verdun, the costliest of World War I in 1916. Food for thought. Europe could not remain united after Charlemagne, in part due to the internal dynastic disputes between its grandsons, but also because of a new series of outside threats, 3 of them to be precise. The first invaders came from the south. Remember how in the centuries after the death of Muhammad, Arab armies went on the offensive and conquered Spain, right? Well, they launched new offensives from their North African base in the 800s, targeting Sicily, Italy, and southern France. The second threat that came from the east, the Magyars, yet another nomadic group from the steppes of Asia that had gradually migrated to Central Europe. They burst onto the scene, caused the usual mayhem, and eventually settled in what is today Hungary. Magyar, by the way, that's another term for the people and language of Hungary. And that's the reason why the Hungarian language is so different from all the other Indo-European languages of Europe. The Hungarians are descendants of an invading Asian horde that came during the Dark Ages. The third threat that came from the north, which is why they're called the Northmen or Normans or the Vikings. We will have a whole lecture on them next time, so I don't want to give everything away, but for our purpose today, just remember that from the 700s to the 900s, they were a constant threat to the coast of Germany, England, and France. So with eternal war inside and foreign enemies at the southern, eastern, and northwestern borders, life in Europe was pretty bleak. I hate to leave you on that sour note, but that's the Dark Ages for you. After the demise of the western part of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, Europe endured centuries of turmoil marked by declining life expectancy, shrinking commerce and cities, legal mayhem, endless dynastic disputes, and to top it off, invasions by Arabs, Magyars, and Vikings. So next time you go on and on about how things were so much better in the olden days, remember that you could have been born as a peasant in the year 700. So far this year, Southwest Louisiana, where I live, has been hit by the COVID epidemic, an economic recession, a devastating hurricane, and dysfunction in Washington. But then, even then, we haven't yet reached the nadir of the Dark Ages. That is some small consolation. Au revoir, and remember one thing. Whether the year is 700 or 2020, things always get better in the end. Goodbye.